Howdy hackers, and welcome to another episode of FairLight TV. Yes, this is now episode, I don't know, 25, 26 or thereabout, and let me be humbly honest and admit that we have been sort of biased towards the Commodore 64. The group FairLight was born on the 64 in 1987, but if you look at what we have also done is that FairLight USA was probably one of the kind of first challengers on the PC cracking scene. Back in the very early days, the leading group was the Humble Guys, and FairLight came to challenge them as the Pepsi Cola of cracking the PC. So we were really early doing really good stuff back when the group in the US, or this side of the group, was led by the not so humble Babe. A very fitting name for challenging the Humble Guys. We have also been very active on Mega Drive. Yeah, we did two things. But on the Super Nintendo, we released the first crack with an intro. So we were the ones introducing crack intros to the Super Nintendo scene. Unheard of before Gaston doing it. But what most people, I would say, back in the days knew us for was the Amiga activity. Or as you're supposed to say when it's about Amiga, you're supposed to do Amiga! I have no idea why they do that. It's sounds a bit retarded, but when you go to copy parties and the Amiga guys are around, they tend to yell that. So you're supposed to say that, I guess. So let's do Amiga for now. So the founding fathers of FairLight is Tony and Christian. Tony, you know him as Strider, and Christian, you know him as Black Shadow. They were in West Coast Crackers up until Easter of 1987. There was an internal party in Kalmar, I think, in April 87. And on the train back home, they were really annoyed by the group and wanted to do their own thing because they had no faith that this group would be sustainable for the future. And they could do everything that the group could do, only the two of them, because Strider was cracking and had the originals, and also Christian was a very skilled cracker. So they didn't need the others. Up until this very time, and this is the reason for referencing this, is Tony was called Number One, and Christian was Galahad. But when forming FairLight, and Christian had been Galahad since his days of WASP, We Against Software Protection. And if you look at WASP, most of the group members of WASP had sort of Knights of the Round Table related names. So you had an Ivanhoe, you had a King Arthur, you had a Lancelot, and then you also had Galahad. But when FairLight was founded, Tony and Christian both changed handle because they wanted the group to have something related to Lords of the Rings. So that's why Tony became Strider and Christian became Black Shadow. So just to make this really, really clear, there has only been one Galahad in FairLight throughout its life, and that is Phil, whom we're going to talk to now. Christian was Galahad to the very day he joined or founded FairLight. He was Galahad only before that. With that out of the way, let's talk to Phil. Oh yeah, and I need to reference one other thing. Sorry about this. Phil is using his laptop, which means that he has very poor lighting, very poor microphone, and very, very poor camera. So sorry, nothing we can do. Torsten will do what he can to kind of fix up or touch up on the video so it will be less horrendous, but just lean back and enjoy the content. The technical details will not be perfect this time. So, Phil, let's talk. Hello and welcome, Phil, whom you know as the Galahad of FairLight and Scoopex. You have to elaborate on that first. Which group are you actually in?
Well, technically I'm in Scoopex, yeah, but also I never really left FairLight. It's just the coming towards the end of the Amiga's life, and the commercial releases were getting thinner and thinner on the ground, and having to eventually kind of hang up the gloves and decide it's time to get a real job, and it's time to do something a bit more important with my time. Having said that, though, if Amiga had still have been relevant and there were still worthy titles to release, then I'm sure we would have still been there doing it. But obviously, I think my last release for Fairlight was Championship Manager 2 in '97. That was kind of pushing it a bit by then, because most of the major software companies had already gone by then, and you just had a few software companies that were releasing their final games that they thought we might get a few thousand sales out of this. I know there were still some biggish commercial titles released later on, but they were so few and far between, and most of them didn't even have any protection. So there's not much role for a cracker that's got nothing to crack. Right. If it's a case of copying stuff off a CD and releasing an archive online, there's not much of a role there left for me. So I didn't really officially quit Fairlight. It's just the sad state is the Amiga was no longer commercially viable. Fairlight had nothing to release on there anymore, and we all just kind of went our separate ways. And then, in all honesty, that was it for the Amiga for me. I did stuff for another 6-7 months or so after Championship Manager 2, and then after that, there was less to do, because for me, it wasn't so much playing the games. Obviously, there was the classic games that you would play, but for me, it was all about the cracking. That was where I got my enjoyment from, was doing that. And when you don't have that anymore, then you don't have as much enthusiasm to remain. And I kind of quit all my computer activities on that side of things. The Amiga got put away, and that was it for about 3-4 years. And then I moved to Bristol in 2000, which is a major city on the west coast of United Kingdom, and I just happened to go on the internet for the first time, and like you do a search for your own name just to see whether or not anyone actually remembers anything you actually did. And it turns out that quite a few people remembered the stuff that I did, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of nice, because you know that you've done stuff that people appreciate, and you know that you've done stuff that people like, but obviously because it's all done clandestinely and behind closed doors where the general public don't get to see it, you don't kind of have an idea of what kind of impact you've had until you do a search on the internet, and people are talking about you in quite nice terms, and that kind of got me back into the Amiga again. And 21 years later, I'm still bloody doing it.
Well, I can totally relate, because first of all, cracking the game, if you do that multiple times, and you also install trainers, games become totally boring, because most of the games you played, and most of the time you played games, you would do it in a trained environment. And that's the whole purpose, is to make it so easy to just play through the game without actually kind of playing the game. So getting to an untrained game is like that experience. I don't seek that anymore. I can't say I care about games that much. So it's just the challenge of cracking them. And so I'm the same as you. And this is sort of, I'm not gaming. If I can't crack, then I might as well do something totally different. But I was happy enough to have my little brother being quite a lot younger. So, and he still had people receiving cracks that we did. So from him, I can sort of collect the information of any impact we potentially made. You didn't have anything like that? Any like finger in the air that would help you kind of perceive what was out there if there was public appreciation?
About the only time I would say is if I went to a copy party,
Yeah.
And I think the last one was a Hellfire party. I can't remember where it was. I got invited by, well, I didn't really want to go because it was quite a distance away, but someone was offering to give me a lift. Oh, I'm passing by where you live, so I can give you a lift if you like. And I'm like, well, there's less excuse for not going, I suppose. And the tickets were a little bit costly. And as soon as the guy asked who I was, and I said who I was ushered straight in without having to pay. And word got around that, you know, someone in Fairlight was there. And I don't want to say it's embarrassing. I mean, I know there's some guys out there that have a real arrogance and they would say, yeah, you will respect me. I'm this guy of this group and I'm brilliant and I'm awesome. But I've never been like that. I've been quite self-conscious. If someone likes my work, I say, like, yeah, thanks very much. Okay. Sometimes they can be a little bit too gushing and it's a little bit embarrassing when you're like, all right, mate, thanks very much for that. And you know, there's a few people wanting to shake your hand and, you know, say, you know, oh, what you did there was brilliant and Fairlight are awesome and they're this, they're that, and what have you. It wasn't just about me. It was obviously the fact that I was a member of Fairlight. And let's be honest, Fairlight were doing amazing things long before I joined. But that was kind of my only real early perception, I would say, that I was something in Amiga circles where, you know, I was being spoken to, you know, quite respectfully and being asked my opinion on daft things as if a cracker knows all the stuff that they're talking about. And that was kind of my first experience there. But I just assumed that these guys are on the scene and they're immersed in that kind of thing. And so, yes, they are going to be intimately aware of, you know, Galahad of FairLight. Oh, right, he'd cracked this, he'd done this, he'd released that last week, and FairLight released this and released that. They're going to know all that. But it's when you meet people that had nothing to do with the scene whatsoever, and they know all the same details and the same information, and they remember all the same things and the effect it had on them, you know, because they got to play this game and it was done properly. It's kind of slightly more important when it's people that weren't connected to the scene, because you kind of expect it from people on the scene because they know the ins and outs. They know who's an idiot. They know who's excellent. They know who's a good graphics artist, who's rubbish, all that kind of stuff. You just don't expect members of the public, just normal members of the public that are not related to the scene whatsoever, to have an opinion and have, you know, quite an informed opinion sometimes on stuff. And you're like, crikey, people really did like this. So,
I mean, it's what do you call it? That when you want to be king of the hill, and these are the top of the pyramid are the guys that you are competing with, but the result of that work trickles down. So people way lower in the pyramid than you were at the time would have would get access to what you did and could form a valid opinion based on that, even if there was no like feedback loop so you can pick it up.
Yeah, I think the other thing is obviously most crackers are quite secretive about who they were, what they did. You know, a lot of guys didn't even know what country some of these crackers were from unless they actually advertised it. And I think for a lot of people, when they actually met a cracker, it's kind of fantasy come true for some, because you know, a cracker is just a shadowy figure that does these, as far as they're concerned, magic and alchemy, and they're like, you know, crikey, there's a cracker in the flesh that living and breathing. You know, it's probably a better experience for them than it is for me, because I get quite embarrassed about too much attention. I just find it a little bit too I don't know. I just don't go out seeking people's approval for what I did, and so when you kind of get, what's the expression I should use? When you kind of get an outpouring of happiness like that, it takes you by surprise sometimes because you just don't expect it.
Overwhelming, I guess. But I mean, the situation in different countries, I mean, the situation was quite different in the different countries. In Germany, they had kind of an active policing towards the scene, so they had to keep a low profile. We didn't really have that in Sweden, but we had an active scene. And I would say for the UK, again, this is my perspective, that you had a very active gaming industry. So a lot of the talents were kind of sucked up by the gaming industry, being on the producing side rather than on the cracking side, whereas we in Sweden didn't really have that. So talents sought alternative outlets for the computer savviness and creativity. So that's why I would say the scene in Sweden was a lot stronger than my perception is of the scene in the UK.
I would say so, because obviously so many publishers and software companies existed in the UK.
Yeah.
That they were quite adept at recruiting from that UK scene, whilst they would moan about piracy and all the rest of it. A lot of these software companies must have known that some of the people they were employing were probably directly involved in cracking some of their previous titles, or if they hadn't cracked it, they had perhaps helped spread it, or they did the logo for the Cracktro, they did the music for the Cracktro. Either way, a hell of a lot of people that worked in the UK software industry were part of the Amiga scene. And it's ridiculous, really, when you consider just how many. But I suppose for the UK software companies, they just saw it as a lot of raw talent that was able to produce good results, probably in some areas to a better degree than some of their more established programmers and what have you, because these other guys they'd ignored the ST, they'd gone beyond the 8-bit machines, and they just totally immersed themselves in the Amiga. So when it came to the likes of Dan of Anarchy deciding to work for Core Design and then bringing half of Anarchy with him, you know, that must have been a very good for Core Design to have all those skills. I mean, you know, you had graphics artists, musicians, and programmers from the demo scene at Core Design, and it showed in some of their games. You know, all of a sudden, some of the Core Design games got that a bit more technical and a bit more special looking, and had a few more bells and whistles. They just kind of, you could see the impact that the Amiga scene was having. But I don't know whether or not the software companies knew just how close the cracking scene was at times. But I was. They never discovered who I was at Team 17. It's probably a bit late for that now, but or Gremlin Graphics, or it was Gremlin Interactive as it was back then. They one of them might watch this and think, "We bloody employed him. What the hell?"
Oh well. So we are up on like episode 25-ish or something. I probably should know this, but I have been preparing a few episodes, so I don't really know how this gets into the sequence. But all of them have been about the C64, and we really want to kind of widen the scope and show that FairLight is more than just the C64, even if that happens to be closest to my heart. So and to be honest, I know extremely little about the cracking on the Amiga. So just tell me, I mean, the rules, I mean, the acknowledged definition of what a crack would be on the Amiga, what would that be? And just for the reference, on the C64, you need to crack everything so it works on the stock C64 with the 1541 disk drive. and it also needs to be cracked to files. That's sort of what you need to do. Otherwise, it doesn't really count. So what will be the equivalent for Amiga? That you can copy it using Xcopy, so it's standard DOS, or what will be the requirement?
Well, the majority of games would have to be able to be copied by a DOS copier. So whether or not that was Workbench's own copy, but as you said, Xcopy, that was the disk copy of choice for most people. It was usually expected to just be a straight Amiga DOS copy of the disk, unless you did it in a special way, like I did with Championship Manager 2. I'd already been told by somebody who worked for the software company that the game was incredibly buggy. And the last thing I wanted was for FairLight to get run down for a buggy crack. So I figured out how the disk format worked for the game. And what I did is I actually ripped both disks to 2 files, which I then compressed. And then I wrote an installer. That game was now on 1 disk, but I wrote an installer which would then rewrite the game back to 2 floppy disks, exactly the same as the original, so that any bugs that appeared in the game, and there were quite a numerous few of them, some of them later in the game were quite game killing as well. I did it so that everybody would be able to play the exact same version as the original. Should the software company release an update, it meant it would work with it. It's not usually the way things were done, but the fact of the matter is the installer disk that I did could be copied by Xcopy, and you could spread that to your friends. They would just have to make their own bespoke copy, on their computer. But it was the only way to ensure that the damn thing was 100% the same as the original. So if anyone said, it bloody crashes, it's a cracking error, we could say, well, actually it's not, because it is 100% a duplicate of the original. But for the most part, what it would simply be is it would have to be X-copied, all the copy protection have to be removed. In the early days, there was lots of single filing going on of games that, loaded in one hit. But because obviously the Amiga was so good at playing samples, then ProTracker modules became more and more common, which meant that the ability to compress the disk down was less, because samples obviously traditionally back then didn't compress very well. Because I know there was the STC was a little bit similar to the Commodore 64, where they too would break it to files, they would turn it into compilations and what have you. But they only had to deal with chip music for the majority of the time, which could only be like a couple of K, but the same tune on the Amiga, it could be like 160K. And that's not going to compress very well. So the usual thing was you just had to remove all the protection. Sometimes they didn't mind, people would think it was lame if you left a disk check in there, but removed the failure at the end of it, it was kind of odd. I don't know why people did that. Most people, they would consider it a proper crack if, for instance, you'd have Rob Northern's copy lock, which would do a test on track 0 for a timed track. In the ordinary course of events, you'd remove that. You wouldn't allow it to make that test, because if the game was on more than one disk, if it couldn't find the copy lock track on one disk, it would then go and search other drives to see if it could find it on other disks. And you could be waiting 30 seconds before it's finished checking all the drives for a track it can't find, and then carry on loading. So the usual thing was all the disk protection read routines would be removed. Any NTSC protection checks would be removed. Whether it was cracked to files or you just figured out the disk format and just turned it back to Amiga DOS tracks, whatever you got to first. I mean, some people obviously for the more common protections, would build readers so that the supplier wouldn't have to send them a 2 meg plus warp file of a disk. When they're like, I know that disk format, I've got a reader for that, and it would read the disk from start to finish. And then the final disk image might only be a meg, which is obviously quicker to send because it was all about the speed.
So you would extract it from the original in basically in a format that the cracker could work with, rather than having a format that included all the potential errors. And you would remove the checks for those errors anyway, so they wouldn't be relevant to you at all.
No. Because obviously a warper is there to it doesn't know the sync marks of the tracks. Yep. It doesn't know what data it's meant to be. Yep. It's just going to take everything off the disk.
A raw dump.
Which means you've got a whole lot of crap there that you don't need. But if you understand the disk format and know the sync and you know how to decode it, well, then you've just basically decoded the entire disk. You've got the data you need. You might be lucky and it might just fit normally on an Amiga DOS disk, and then you've just got to change the parameters of the loader to say, right, we're going for a DOS disk and it's this size and it's not this size anymore. You might be a little bit unlucky where the disk format is bigger than an Amiga DOS disk, and so you've got extra data which you've then got to put onto another disk, and then you've got to come up with a sane scheme to disk swap. But yeah, I mean, it didn't make any difference if it was cracked to files or it was cracked to normal Amiga DOS tracks. Yep. So long as that game was 100% cracked, most people didn't have too much to say. Sometimes people would say it was lame if a previously 512K game needed 1 meg to run, but by 1991, 1 meg was standard on the Amiga, and it really wasn't that much of an issue. I mean, some of these games, they literally did fill every single last byte of memory in that 512K, and you'd be struggling to fit a loader in there, crack routines and all the rest of it. And sometimes your only way of getting around it was to, require the user to have, the slow RAM in the trapdoor slot, which was like £35. And I think it's because of that, which is why more Amiga owners went out and got them and had them fitted. Oh. And it ended up being the standard spec for Commodore. By 91, the A500, I think it was the 1.3 ECS machines, they were standard 1 meg of memory. And that was, 1990? So, and when Team 17 came into being in 91, their whole ethos was 1 meg only. They're not ever going to cater for 512K. So, they did quite well. So I don't think it was much of a problem.
Scouting for little pockets of memory that you can utilize for your own stuff. That's one of the key things you do on a 64 as well. I need to have my loader wedged in somewhere, and I have 64K of memory, and the 63 point whatever is absolutely full. So how do I find something? Is there a pocket of crap that I can fill with zeros and wedge in my stuff, and or isn't there? You need to find out, otherwise you can't make a release.
We were quite lucky if the game had copy lock, because obviously we would do away with the copy lock routines, which were quite big, and it meant that we could fit a loader in the space where the copy lock was. Yeah. Because some of these MFM disk format loaders were tiny, absolutely tiny, and you couldn't fit your loader in there, or you'd have to hope that you could find a spare piece of memory to jump to it to get it to go and go to your load routines. But if it had a copy lock, it made life a lot easier. You just chuck your loader in there and you knew it was never going to get overwritten. But some of these games that use 512K and they filled every single bit, you were just pulling your hair out and thinking, whilst I'm pulling my hair out, trying to keep it working in 512K, there's a cracker in another group going, yeah, we'll just make that 1 meg. And he's busy doing it as 1 meg, and he's closer to release, and they're going to win. And the fact of the matter is once they've uploaded that onto the boards and everyone's downloaded it and everyone realizes 100%, no one gives a toss that it's 1 meg because most people have got 1 meg. So it's a nothing complaint in the end. But yeah, some people do like to moan about useless stuff like that.
Unless there is some sort of list that has requirements and you cannot be on the list unless you fulfill 512k of as a requirement for a valid release. And well, I mean, there are always lists and there would always be haters that's going to hate, but in the end, the early working version tends to be the favored one. We were lucky on the 64 during one period when the first release was sort of one thing. And then we had the magazine Gamers Guide. They would list every release. So they sort of encouraged that everybody would make a version of every game, basically. And then you could compete. And even if you released like 2 weeks late, if you had more trainers, fewer files, and what have you not, then you can be on the top of the Gamers Guide quality list, even if you didn't have the first release.
It was slightly different on the Amiga. The only way that another release was tolerated was if you'd proven that the first release wasn't cracked properly,
yeah,
or was maybe a pre-release had been leaked by a software company and wasn't the final version. They had what they often call as final sales version, where it might have only a few differences, like some extra logos and maybe some gameplay tweaks, but they were considered legitimate releases because it was the final version that was available in the shops. If it wasn't cracked properly, it was perfectly legitimate to release the game again, pointing out obviously that these bunch of idiots hadn't done it properly. But usually if a game had been released and it had been decided it was of 100% and it was the final sales version, another group couldn't come along 2 hours later and release the same thing. It would just be nuked off all the boards. They'd be like, what are you doing? It's been done. It's 100%. Move on. We're on to the next one now. Yeah. So it wasn't quite like that on the Amiga, but in all honesty, I think the Amiga scene was a scene apart from the other scenes. The Atari ST scene, I get the impression that they cracked the stuff and they did their compilations and they released it when they were good and ready. Whereas on the Amiga, it was always. It's what always surprised me is when I joined FairLight. When I was in other groups, it was all kind of, yeah, we're going to get this game. Can you crack it when we get it in a couple of days' time? Yeah, I'll do that for you. And then, yeah, where do you want me to upload it? Oh, I'll be home later on. You can upload it to me then. Whereas Fairlight was like, bang, 9 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. They've already checked to see what's being released. 9:30. They've already got the game. They've already rang around all the crackers to check who's going to be cracking it. Yeah. They've come back, and then it's just the race. It's the race because it's not just Fairlight. It's every other group as well. So on the Amiga, it literally was about the speed of everything. Other scenes seem to take their time, and in all honesty, I think it was to the Amiga scene's detriment sometimes, because sometimes having to be so fast, you just couldn't always be as efficient and as sure that what you've done was 100%. I mean, I was always reluctant to write 100% on any crack tro, because you know damn well that someone's going to go and have a look at it and see if they can find something wrong and start poking the fingers saying, it's not 100%. But they were the best of times, though. For me, it wasn't just the cracking, it was the whole race from the second you got the phone call to the original supply getting back with it and cracking it and having to constantly answer the phone. Have you done it yet? Have you done it yet? No, I haven't done it yet. I'm still busy with it, mate. Come on. And then getting everybody ready, it's fantastic. And you're just racing because you know that the other cracking groups are doing the exact same thing. Yeah. You just don't want to get beaten on something, and especially if it's a moderately easy protection, you just want to be getting in there and doing it. But then you're guessing yourself, you're thinking, is there going to be a sneaky checksum in there? you know, have I checked enough to make sure that it's got to go, it's got to be packaged up, it's got to be uploaded, it's do or die, and you know, take the chance. And thankfully, the majority of the time, we got it right. You know, occasionally we got it wrong, but yeah, it was the race. That was the best part of it. It was far better than actually playing any of the games.
Yeah, I totally agree. For me, it was it is the social experience of being part of that movement. It's not the game itself. It's the
no, I mean, playing the game got in the way of actually getting the damn thing released. But you're having a play test of some description to make sure that you'd actually done it properly, and you're like, oh, I don't want to be playing this, I just want to be uploading it. But yeah.
So if we elaborate on the actual protections, I mean, on the C64 we have tapes and we have discs, and you are lucky here that you only have like one format. It would be the disc. So the boot sectors and alien disk formats such as MFM and all of that, and then checksums. What else? What would be the typical like protection?
Well, I would say the majority of the protections was a normal Amiga-DOS disk that was sector loading, and it would have one protection track somewhere on the disk, and it would just test that track to make sure it was there. And a lot of them would just go into a fail routine when it wasn't there, and that would be that. Which obviously, from a cracker's point of view, is brilliant because you've got 99.99% of the information off the disk. Other than the protection track, it makes your life a lot easier. But then you had the exotic disk formats, obviously where we describe it as the MFM format, and that's when things got slightly tricky because the Amiga disk controller was very, very versatile, and it could read quite long tracks, and it could store a lot of data. Excuse me. You could have different sync marks, you know, so you couldn't just blindly read the disk without knowing what the sync mark was, different sizes, different encoding routines, which you'd need to know to actually be able to, you know, read the disk. And the crackers for the most part preferred MFM games because there was a perception that they were more difficult, because right from the off, all you had on the disk that was unprotected was the boot routine. That was the only track on the disk that would show up as green and X copy, and every single other track would show up as an error, and you were having to rip the entire disk to get the damn thing cracked. And you had some guys that I'm guessing they must have been ex-crackers. They knew what we were doing, and they would try and throw in as many different things to screw around with us. They'd have different sync marks throughout the disk, different formats throughout the disk, different size tracks, so to stop you from just done reading the entire disk and having the data. I mean, that is the problem with the Amiga. I think when the Amiga and the Atari ST came out, that is when computers really started to become big business for the software companies. And as a result, they made the fatal mistake of automating things like copy protection. So Rob Northern, I don't know if he had ever done anything on the Commodore 64. I know he did stuff on the BBC Micro, but he did a copy lock, which was a protection track. And he also did something called PDOS, which was his protection DOS long MFM format. And lots of people use both, which is great for Rob Northern, and it's great for crackers, because if you're going to keep on using the same expected MFM format, then us crackers are going to build a reader that, once it's given a few parameters, will blind read that disk. The original supplier will send it to us. We know we've got all the data that we need from the disk decoded, and then all we've got to do is just get it back onto a disk or get the extra off the disk onto another disk, and the release is done. You know, Gremlin Interactive, they had an MFM format that they used on lots and lots of games. an absolute schoolboy error. It's foolhardy, because whilst that will stop the casual copier, to to crackers, you've got a game that's maybe, say something like Zool, that's got MFM format on 2 discs and a document check. Well, that MFM format was removed in the first 5 minutes. Whilst the original supplier's uploading the first disc to the cracker, he's already imaging the second disc, which has decoded all the MFM off it, and he'll be sending that along. And then all the cracker's got to do is patch the loader, crack the document check, stick the Cracktro on, and a game which on the surface looks like it should take maybe 4 or 5 hours, has probably taken an hour tops, if that. And that's the problem, is a lot of the protections were automated, where they would just use standard protections offered by companies or people, which was great for us, because then we could, we know we'd have the means of reading it in or looking for it. It's like the Rob Northern copy lock. I mean, some people try to disguise when it was testing the disc. I mean, when you go back to the first Amiga games that are released with copy lock, you had games like Stunt Car Racer and lots of Houston titles that loaded in one go. And so the game would load from track 0 up to maybe track 60. And the first thing it would do was a Rob Northern copy lock check, where it would step down to track 0, test the track, and then step back up to the last track that it had read before the copy lock. Well, when you hear that enormous grind on a disk drive, you know that it's something out of the ordinary, and you need to investigate that. Later, people that use copy lock, they got a bit more inventive, where they would ensure that they had to load a file near where the copy lock was, which meant that the disk drive didn't have to step as far, and you might even miss the noise that it makes as it steps and then steps back to where it was before. The only problem with trying to be sneaky like that is it doesn't change the fact that the header of the copy lock in memory has not changed since 1990. You only have to search for one string in memory, and there's the copy lock. So unless someone's gone to the trouble of obfuscating it, maybe writing it backwards or encrypting it, it doesn't make any difference what you're doing with that copy lock, where you're trying to make it discreetly test the disk. They've all got the same header, so we can see it straight away. But checksums, I would say, were the biggest bugbear. I mean, there were some checksums out there that were an absolute joke. It's like, if you got caught out by these particular checksums, you'd be banging your head against the wall, going, Jesus, how did I get caught out by that? That's really amateur. That is. That's really bad. Some checksums, could take you a good couple of hours to track down. They weren't so blatant. They were mixed in routines that looped maybe 600 times to build up a checksum value, but it would be mixed in with drawing routines or screen clear routines, so it wasn't automatically obvious what it was doing and why it was crashing. And a lot of those kind of things were done by ex-crackers that obviously having gone through it themselves, knew what they didn't want to see, and so made sure that they put a bit more effort in. But a lot of the copy protections on the Amiga were it's just like, why did you bother?
When you have the unprotected original and that is sent to somebody else, they can only do so much, because it's sort of, you can't inject something inside the game. That needs to be sort of, then the protection needs to be part of the development cycle as well, where you would check for certain things. I mean, even the checksums inside the game, it's if you check your own code, the game code, but then you would only basically be able to check for implemented trainers and stuff. But
I know that in the early days that that's what would happen is they would send the master to someone like Rob Northern and he would protect it. But I also know that later that all changed, where he would send his copy lock routines and he would send them discs with the key, the protection track written on there so they could test it, so they could actually implement his protection properly, because he understood the value of having his protection as many times as possible in different places. Yeah. I mean, there's the famous example of Xenon 2 on the Amiga. And disc 1 of Xenon 2 has the intro and it has the code for the game. And then disc 2 is just the levels data. But someone screwed up at the Bitmap Brothers, because on disc 1 is all the documents from Rob Northern about how Copylock works.
Oops.
And oops. I mean, we'd already figured out Copylock by then anyway, but you could see that he was getting a little bit frustrated with the way that people were implementing his protection, because he was putting in hints and tips in there about how to implement his protection so it wasn't so obvious. I mean, some of this, as an example, that some of the developers were doing is the way that Copylock worked in the early days is it would do a test of the track, and it would produce a unique serial key, 32-bit serial key in register D0. And then the game would obviously check to make sure that that serial key matched up with what it was expecting, which is fine. But when you're putting in your code a compare long word 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 with D0, a great big massive number like that, even the world's most amateur cracker is going to look at that and think, oh, is that the serial key then, is it? Is that the serial key for the disk? Yeah. It's like the developer has made no attempt to obfuscate. You know, the Copylock was fairly reliable. Other than a few minor mishaps with a couple of games, that serial key wouldn't fail. If a protection track was there, the serial key wouldn't fail. And so Rob Northern's telling them, don't check for it, do calculations based off the serial key to set things up. If the serial key is correct, then your setup routines are all going to work and the game's going to work. If the serial key's wrong, then obviously it's not going to work and the game's going to crash, and you know it's a pirate copy, without putting a stupid piece of code which directly compares the serial key, which gives it to the cracker, which means that they don't even have to jump through any hoops to get the serial number in the first place. So it was quite amusing to see him trying to explain to these developers, look, here's how you should be implementing it, not like this, and don't do it like this, and don't do it like this. But then you think about a lot of the developers, they were writing games for the likes of Ocean and US Gold and all the rest of it. I don't think they cared. They just got told, here's this copy lock, stick it in the game, do a check for it, and make sure the game fails if it can't find it. All right, yeah, okay. They're getting paid for the game no matter what. You know, they've just been asked to convert Double Dragon 2 to the Amiga, so they're going to do it, and they've done it. They're not getting any extra money for stopping idiots like me from cracking their copy protection. They haven't got time for that. They're going to be working on the next game. They're getting paid no matter what. And I think that's part of the problem, is there was too many people where in the software industry that just didn't care about that kind of thing. And copy protection seemed to be a bit of an afterthought, which it never can be. It has to be as big a consideration as who we're going to get to do the music, who we're going to get to do the graphics. It has to be part of the development process. Yeah. Because when you've got some basic idiot who's just messing around has managed to crack your copy protection, then you think to yourself, why have you even bothered?
So, it was a very long talk with Phil, and yeah, let's not like overload one episode. Let's split it up here, and let's have another episode coming up next Friday with the rest of the interview with Phil. So stay tuned until next Friday. Bye bye.